والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. So inshallah, just a quick recap like we did last week for anyone who's new. This is inshallah a weekly session that we'll hold every week at 11 a.m. And we'll be going over the 40 ahadith of Imam Nawawi rahimahullah. And actually it's 42 ahadith, but pretty much he gathers a collection of the ahadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam that talk about different topics, from charity to other important topics within Islam. And essentially, I'm going over a book that's associated with these ahadith. It's a sharh, it's explanation, called Jami' al-Ulumi wal-Hikam by Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali rahimahullah. And essentially, he explains these comments on these ahadith and explains them. So what I do every single week is read a chapter and then try to summarize as much as I can into a short 20, 25, 30-minute lecture. And then we have Q&A right afterwards, inshallah. So without wasting any more time, inshallah, go ahead and start. We're on hadith number 37. عن ابن عباس رضي الله عنهما عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم فيما يرويه عن ربه تبارك وتعالى قال إن الله كتب الحسنات والسيئات ثم بين ذلك فمن هم بحسنة فلم يعملها كتبها الله عنده حسنة كاملة وإن هم بها فعملها كتبها الله عنده 10 حسنات إلى 700 ضعفا إلى أضعاف كثيرة وإن هم بسيئة فلم يعملها كتبها الله عنده حسنة كاملة وإن هم بها فعملها كتبها الله سيئة واحدة. رواه البخاري ومسلم. Now, on the authority of Ibn Abbas رضي الله عنهما عن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم, from what he's narrating from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he's saying this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he's conveying the meaning of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is trying to tell us. Verily, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has written down the good deeds and the evil deeds, and then explained it by saying, whosoever intends to perform a good deed but did not do it, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala writes it down with himself as a complete good deed. And if he intends to perform it and then did perform it, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala writes it down with himself as 10 good deeds up to 700 times, and up to many times multiplied. And if he intended to perform an evil deed but did not do it, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala writes down with himself as a complete good deed. And if he intended to do an evil deed and then he did perform it, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala writes down only one evil deed. And now, essentially the entire lecture for today, or the entire hadith for today, is describing 4 things, 4 different types of actions. The first one, which we'll go over right now, is good deeds. So the act of performing good deeds and having the intention to do the good deed and then performing it, right? So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, إذا أحسن أحدكم إسلامه فكل حسنة يعملها تكتب بعشر أمثالها إلى 700 ضعف وكل سيئة يعملها تكتب بمثلها حتى يلقى الله. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam essentially says that if we have ihsan in our Islam, if we perfect our Islam, then we will have our good deeds multiplied. And he gives a range. He gives a range of 10 to 700, right? And within this range, and this is an important concept to talk about, is how do we get the maximum amount of good deeds from this range? Because of course we all want to maximize. Imagine you do the same action, but for one action you're getting it multiplied by 10 times in terms of the number of good deeds. And then the other one, you have it multiplied by 700 times. So the way to have it multiplied to be 700 times or even more, according to whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants, is to have his husn in Islam, ihsan, to perfect our Islam and to perfect our intention when doing that action. And then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam continues and says, in every bad deed that a Muslim who has husn Islam, a perfected Islam does, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will write for him just that, that one bad deed until he meets Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is a very, very important point that we have to take and try to reflect on and contemplate, that how can I purify my intention when doing any good deed for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so that I can inshallah multiply the amount of good deeds I'm getting from these actions. Because if we think about it, when you go throughout your day, you do many things on a regular basis that if you, for example, redid your intention, reviewed your intention, and made the intention beforehand that before I do this action, I'm doing it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I'm looking, inshallah, to get this ajr of 700 times or even more. Like for example, we make wudu multiple times a day, right? Imagine before I make wudu, I sit down and I clearly say to myself that I'm seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's forgiveness. I'm seeking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give me as much ajr as possible, and I'm doing it sincerely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And inshallah you'll have those ajr multiplied, those good deeds multiplied. And an ayah that the commenter Ibn Rajab quotes in his explanation of this part of the hadith is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where he says, مثل الذين ينفقون أموالهم في سبيل الله كمثل حبة أنبتت 7 سنابل في كل سنبلة 100 حبة والله يضاعف لمن يشاء والله واسع عليم. So essentially, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is giving us an example. He's giving us an analogy of the person who spends their wealth or gives for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Who gives, whether it's donation or spends his wealth for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The example or the analogy is like a grain that sprouts into 7 ears, each one bearing 100 grains. So in total 700. And then look at the ending of the ayah. وَاللَّهُ يُضَاعِفُ لِمَن يَشَاءُ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala multiplies for whoever He wills. So this 700 grains that are coming out of spending for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this can be multiplied and multiplied and multiplied to a point that only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows. And this is a very important point to understand. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says يُضَاعِفُ لِمَن يَشَاءُ, there's no mathematical way for us to calculate or for us to understand as limited human beings how much can Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala multiply these good deeds. So if you keep that in mind, especially this important point of donation for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is spending wealth in the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is something that, inshallah, again, if we have ihsan, husn Islam, if we perfect our Islam and purify the intention and renew our intention and do it for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then inshallah we can have our good deeds multiplied. And then, the commenter also, he had a small paragraph I wanted to read, inshallah, to benefit from. He says, وَقَدْ ذَكَرْنَا فِي مَا سَبَقَ فِي شَرْحِ الْحَدِيثِ مِنْ حُسْنِ إِسْلَامِ الْمَرْءِ تَرْكُهُ مَا لَا يَعْنِيهِ. So in the previous hadith, one of the 40 hadith Imam Nawawi, there was a hadith that said, مِنْ حُسْنِ إِسْلَامِ الْمَرْءِ, that from the perfection of the Islam of a Muslim, from a human, is تَرْكُهُ مَا لَا يَعْنِيهِ, is leaving what has nothing to do with him. And he says, أن مضاعفة الحسنات زيادة على العشر تكون بحسب حسن الإسلام. This is what we've been talking about before, that increasing past that 10 times mark is based on the perfection of the person's Islam. كما جاء ذلك مصرحا به في حديث أبي هريرة وغيره وتكون بحسب كمال الإخلاص. And again, this was mentioned in another hadith by Abu Hurairah, and it's to do with your ikhlas, your sincerity when performing that action. وبحسب فضل ذلك العمل في نفسه وبحسب الحاجة إليه. Now this is the part I want to focus on. And this is a very, very, very important point. He says, وبحسب فضل ذلك العمل بنفسه. And it's also based off of the fadl, the virtue of that action in and of itself. So for example, if we take the example I gave before of wudu versus I compare it to the hadith we talked about last week about removing kurbatan, kurbat dunya, off of another Muslim, like a bala'un shadid, a very hard test off another Muslim, the amount of hasanat that come for that, right? And if we compare that with the example of wudu, there's more virtue in one of these actions. And then notice, you can say the measure for how to see how much virtue is in that action. Notice what he says afterwards. وَبِحَسْبِ الْحَاجَةِ إِلَيْهِ. And based off of the need for that action. So for example, to take the most obvious and the most in our face example that's happening right now is the people in Gaza. We see obviously they need food and they need water. They need someone to come and rescue them. They need someone to come and liberate their land. They need this ummah to act. Right? And we see obviously the ummah is, whether it's from the rulers or whether it's from anyone else, from scholars, etc., we see an inaction in the sense that people are speaking up, we don't see anyone actually moving to help the Muslims in Gaza. Now, if we take this hadith and put it in context of the situation, imagine the amount of virtue someone could have if he was able to help our brothers and sisters in Gaza and remove the occupation from them. Imagine. Again, notice the words. وَبِحَسْبِ فَضْلِ ذَلِكَ الْعَمَلِ بِنَفْسِهِ. That they're being oppressed and they're being killed. So this is very, very virtuous. And then, وَبِحَسْبِ الْحَاجَةِ إِلَيْهِ. After almost a year of this genocide continuing, the least we can do is at least speak up and try to help our brothers and sisters in Gaza. And again, keep this hadith in mind when we're doing this. That while I'm speaking up, while I'm doing whatever I can, while, like we said before in the ayah, if I'm spending in the cause of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, if I'm donating, when I'm doing that, I need to have a sincere intention and have ikhlas, sincerity, and have an intention that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I'm doing what I can and I'm looking for His ajr. And imagine Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of course, will multiply to a degree that we can't even fathom. And then, of course, the commentary quotes ayat from the Quran to prove this statement. He says, "Man ja'a bil hasanati falahu 'ashru amthaluha." This is the person who comes with a good deed, then he gets 10 times for that one good deed. And then also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَإِن تَكُ حَسَنَةً يُضَاعِفُهَا وَيُؤْتِ مِن لَدُنْهُ أَجْرًا عَظِيمًا. And then if it is a good deal, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will give him ajr azima, is like a great reward. And of course that span is up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, to move on to the next type of action in the 4 actions is bad deeds, right? So the doing of bad deeds. And the hadith very clearly states that doing a bad deed is only written down as one bad deed on your scale or in your book on the Day of Judgment. And this is a point that for us to reflect on. That imagine, we just talked about how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will multiply our good deeds, multiply them. We said from 10 to 700 to even more based off the action. Versus, someone could do a very bad deed and that person will get one bad deed for it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of His mercy, out of His rahmah, does not multiply the sins of the Muslim. So this point is very, very important to understand. And then to add one more thing that was very interesting actually from the commentary, he explains that also within the 4 sacred months in Islam, which the 4 sacred months are Dhul Qa'dah, Dhul Hijjah, Muharram and Rajab, within these 4 months actually, the sins the sins that a Muslim commits is actually also heavier. It's also multiplied. But also at the same time, the good deeds are also multiplied. And also another interesting point, this was one that was completely new to me, I didn't know this, that also some of the Sahaba, they used to be very careful, or they used to be very scared of committing sins in Mecca specifically. And there's a saying from Umar al-Khattab radiallahu anhu where he says, لأن أخطأ 70 خطيئة يعني بغير مكة أحب إلي من أن أخطئ بخطيئة واحدة بمكة. The Umar al-Khattab is saying to do 70 sins in a place other than Mecca is more beloved to me than to commit one single sin within Mecca. So, and that's just a point also to reflect on, that the sacredness of the place, the sacredness of the time, those are factors that play into the possibility of bad deeds being multiplied. And now, the next point I want to focus on is that it's also possible for someone who is close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or someone who is in an environment where he's being reminded 24/7 of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and of this bad deed, that it also could get multiplied. And this is something the commentator Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali rahimahullah also mentions. He says, and it is possible. So he doesn't say conclusively, this hadith is an ayah for it with proof. He says, and it is possible. And he gives different ayahs, Surah Ahzab, where it says that the wives of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that if they approached the bad deed, it would be multiplied. But also, if they approached the good deed, it would be multiplied. So he gave evidences, but his point that he was trying to make off of this is that a person who's close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or a person who is knowledgeable in the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or someone again who's in an environment where he is being held accountable, but he continues on that path of committing that bad deed, it's not like this hadith will restrain him to only one bad deed. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could multiply that based off of the situation. And now to move on to the third type of action the hadith mentions, which is the sincere intention to do a good deed. And now this also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala of course says he will give us the good, as if we did the action, right? Give us good deeds for that action, even though we actually didn't do it, we didn't get to actually do it, but we had a sincere intention for it. Now, in the first paragraph of this section, the commentary mentions a very beautiful paragraph. Because a lot of times when we read this hadith, we think to our heads, okay, especially if we're reading the English translation, right? We'll think to ourselves, okay, if I just intend to do a good deed, then I'll get that ajr, I'll get that good deed without actually doing it, or without making a sincere conviction to actually do that action. So in the first paragraph, he outlines what it means to actually have the intention to do that good deed. So he says, النوع الثالث, the third type, الهم بالحسنات فتكتب حسنة كاملة, that the intention to do good deeds, and that good deed is written as a full good deed, as if you did the action. وإن لم يعملها, even if you didn't do it. كما في حديث ابن عباس وغيره وفي حديث أبي هريرة الذي خرجه مسلم كما تقدم إذا تحدث عبدي بأن يعمل حسنة فأنا أكتبها له حسنة. That is a hadith where essentially, like we said before, that if my slave speaks, that he speaks to himself and he intends to do a good deed, but he doesn't get to do it, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will write it as a good deed for us. And then it continues, he says, وَالظَّاهِرُ أَنَّ الْمُرَادْ بِالتَّحَدُّث حديث النفس وهو الهم وفي حديث خريم بن فاتك من هم بحسنة فلم يعملها فعلم الله أنه قد أشعرها قلبه وحرص عليها كتبت له حسنة. وهذا يدل على أن المراد بالهم هنا هو العزم المصمم الذي يوجد معه الحرص على العمل، لا مجرد الخطرة التي تخطر ثم تنفسخ من غير عزم ولا تصميم. So essentially, he's describing the previous hadith I read before, and he's saying, وَالظَّاهِرُ أَنَّ الْمُرَادَ بِالتَّحَدُّث, that the outer meaning, or the most obvious meaning from speaking to oneself, is speaking to yourself, like making the intention, planning to do that action. And this is conviction. This is like an intention where you plan out and you make a plan of how you're going to do it. And then in another hadith, من هم بحسنة فلم يعملها, whoever intends to do a hasana and does not do it, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's in his heart. He knows that he planned on doing that action. So based off of that knowledge, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives him that good deed. So this is the key point to focus on, right? That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's in the heart, and he knows if you sincerely intended to do that or not. So we can't play games with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that, I'll make intention that I'll do this good deed, or make intention that I'll pray sunnah, but then when the time comes, I'll be like, you know what, actually I don't really feel like doing it. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what's in your heart. He knows, did you sincerely put the effort and sincerely try to do that good deed? And that's why he says right after, وَحَرَصَ عَلَيْهَا, that he ran after, he chased after it. He did everything he could to do that good deed. And then it'll be written for him as a good deed. And this is evidence that the meaning of alham, that this intention or the sincerity to that deed, is huwa al-azmu. It is the conviction. It's conviction that I'm doing this because I genuinely want to do it, and I take all the means to do it. And the last part I want to focus on, الحرص على العمل لا مجرد الخطرة التي تخطر. That it's, again, chasing after the action, not just the idea that comes to the mind and I say, oh, I would like to do this, but then I don't do it. And this is the point I want to focus on. A lot of the times we read this hadith and we think, okay, if I just have the intention to do a good deed without a clear plan of action, without a clear action plan that I implement, that I actually chase after this action, I try to do as much as I can, without that, then of course up to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then we wouldn't actually be getting that good deed without the action, without fulfilling that intention that we have. And this shows us the severity or the seriousness of action in Islam, right? For example, sometimes you see some people saying like, "Oh, I'll become a better Muslim one day," or "One day I'll start doing this," or "One day I'll start doing that." One day I'll come closer to Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. Now, of course, we're not judging on the person's intention, right? But reflect within yourself, or the person who says this has to reflect within themselves that, okay, this is a good thing, right? That I want to become closer to Allah Subhanahu wa Taala. But now, am I taking the actual actions that correspond to that sincerity? Or am I claiming sincerity without committing to any actions to show that sincerity to Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala? Because imagine if you do say, you know what, okay, I want to start praying 5 times a day, and I want to make sure I commit to my 5 daily prayers, right? This is obviously a good intention, to do a good deed. Now, let's say I put an action plan down that I'll start sleeping at this time, sleeping earlier, or I'll start moving around my schedule and planning my classes, my courses around Jum'ah, or around Dhuhr, around Asr, etc. And this is taking a genuine action to make sure that I'm not just saying I'm sincere to Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. I'm not saying that, oh, I plan on praying 5 times a day, but then I don't. But I'm taking action to actually try and sit down and do that. And of course, salah is an example that's fard, right? This is an obligation. It's not something where it's like, oh, if I don't get to do it, then, oh, it's not a huge deal. You have to do it. But if we use that example for anything else, like giving donation or praying sunnah, etc. So that point has to be very clear in our minds, that sincerity is not just on the tongue, but it's also in the actions. And then the last category that the hadith mentions is the intention to do a bad deed. So the commentary, and this is also another kind of misconception that sometimes we kind of miss, I guess, when reading the hadith, is there's 2 types of within this category actually. So when you intend to do a bad deed, like let's say for example you intended to backbite, but then you didn't backbite. Whether you actually get the sayyi'ah, the bad deed or not, is actually based off one condition, which is the reason why you didn't do that bad deed, in this example, the ghibah, the backbiting. If it's left for the sake of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, that I didn't backbite because I remembered, I had the intention to backbite, but then I remembered Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala is watching me. That I remembered that this is like eating the flesh of my brother. And you remembered these things, and then you said, you know what, I'm not going to backbite. Then you stopped. Then in this case, of course, Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala will write for you a good deed. And why is it written as good deed if we contemplate on that? Why? It's because you remembered Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala in that time that you were going to sin, and you stopped yourself. But now, on the other side, the flip side, if I planned to backbite, and then I didn't, but the reason was because of someone else stopped me, or for fear of the people. The specific condition that the commentary mentions is actually fear of the people. Or he says, I don't want to do it in front of people because it might make him his status essentially be lowered. That I can't backbite in front of other people because I'm supposed to be someone who's very practicing, etc. In that case, the person's not going to get a good deed written for him, but actually the opposite happens. He has a bad deed written for him. So imagine like the gravity of that, right? That we have to. That's how important intention is. You have to review your intention, and that's why when we say sincerity and husn Islam, sincerity to perfecting your Islam, it's that genuinely I move through my life doing good deeds for the sake of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. I don't do good deeds so that I can have someone compliment me. I don't do good deeds so I can have someone say, or people say in general, that I'm someone who's very Islamic and I'm very this, I'm very that. And again, notice that if I am doing it for those reasons, even when I'm avoiding a bad deed, imagine, which the default is for me to get a good deed, right? I'm avoiding a bad deed for the sake of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala, and I avoid it, I'm supposed to get a good deed. But because you did it for the people, now you get a bad deed. And this is again where riyat, showing off, comes in, and this is where checking your intention becomes very, very, very important. So with that, inshallah, we'll go ahead and end off. وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين وجزاكم الله خيرا والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله